Hello and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, hi, I'm Cassidy. If it's not, thanks for always tuning into my videos. Today, we are doing a little bit of a different video. I wanted to do if you like this book, read all of these. So, with this, we're doing if you like the Daevabad trilogy. If you like City of Brass, read all of these books. And I'm going to tell you recommendations for different things that you might have liked about the book to then go off of, if that makes sense. So, the first category I have is if you liked the romance element of City of Brass. If you kind of liked the rooting for our two protagonists to get together while still having a little bit of fantasy and politics, which I feel like is a big thing about City of Brass, is you're kind of getting a little bit of both and why it works so well for so many audiences, I would suggest The Bridge Kingdom by Daniel L. Jensen. So The Bridge Kingdom is a little bit more romance heavy. It's more classified as a fantasy romance, where City of Brass is classified as a fantasy. But I think if you liked that romance aspect, The Bridge Kingdom is a good way to go. And The Bridge Kingdom follows our two protagonists who come from rival countries that are then put into an arranged marriage. But there's a bunch of politics and a bunch of scheming that happens. The setting in this I think is very cool, and I really enjoyed our main characters and all the nasty scheming that happens. I don't want to say too much because I feel like a lot of this book is really good just not knowing anything going into it. But yeah, I would definitely recommend that one for the romance part. Next I have, if you liked the mythology that was in City of Brass, try an Ember in the Ashes. I feel like this is pretty self-explanatory, but they're both based on Middle Eastern mythology and folklore, so we have the jinns and all of that. I will say An Ember in the Ashes reads YA. It is a YA series. We are following very YA tropes, but I found it very interesting to see the differences in the interpretations of this mythology and this lore, and I really enjoyed both of them. The Ember in the Ashes follows three protagonists. One who is part of the rebellion and one who is working for the Empire. And there's a bit of a romance in this one too, so if you did enjoy the romance aspect of City of Brass, you could enjoy this, but it's much more of a typical YA romance than City of Brass is. If you liked the fantastical elements, if you liked the fantasy, that it was a little bit more high fantasy, a little bit more dense than some other reads, The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. I feel like this is self-explanatory, as I always recommend if you want to start reading fantasy, like adult fantasy, City of Brass and The Final Empire are like my go-tos. But it's because they both do this thing where they're very accessible, but yet us high fantasy readers that read it all the time still really love and enjoy them. So I would recommend reading Mistborn series, reading Final Empire if you enjoyed that part. Mistborn follows a world where it's what if the bad guy won? What if at the end of the whole thing, the evil guy goes into powers, and that's what happens, and we start our series with the evil guy in power, and we're trying to take him down. There's a heist, and we are following a really unique magic system. Specifically at the time it was written is very unique. I think we're starting to see a lot more Mistborn-like magic systems come out, but it was very unique, I think, at the time it was published, where the Mistborn can ingest metals to get their powers. Only some people can ingest metals. Most of the time they can only do 1 or 2 metals, but a Mistborn can do them all. If you preferred Nari's POVs, and specifically the learning the magic system with our protagonist part of it, I found with Nari, it was often just getting the world building. She was experiencing something new for the first time. If you liked kind of learning your world, learning your magic that way, here are some recommendations for you. My first one is Red Sister by Mark Lawrence. This one is darker than City of Brass. Red Sister does lean grimdark, but not in the sense of like Prince of Thorns or First Law. It just has a little bit of a darker tone, but I think there still are a lot of hopeful moments in Red Sister, which doesn't make it entirely grimdark. I would say the Poppy War is way more grimdark than Red Sister, but Red Sister does have a little bit of that tone to it. In Red Sister, we're following Nona Grey, who is 13 at the beginning of this, I believe, and she gets sent off to the Covenant of Sweet Mercy, which is a covenant of assassin nuns. So 13-year-old Nona is learning her powers, going through school, and we follow her journey through the school, Red Sister, Grey Sister. There's a year in between that, and then Holy Sister, it's a 4-year school, but we have 3 books. And you're truly learning the magic system with Nona because she doesn't really know what she's capable of. And I think that if you really enjoyed that aspect, that is what made Red Sister such an easy read, and it is one of the reasons I still do suggest Red Sister for beginner fantasy. Maybe not your very first fantasy, but after you read City of Brass, I think that you could handle it. I have so many for Nari's, if you like Nari's POVs. Another one I would suggest is Of Blood and Fire by Ryan Cahill. This is an indie self-pubbed book. We are following a character who gets kind of thrust into the rebellion when he is the first person in thousands of years to bond with a dragon egg outside of the Empire that is bad. Empire bad. New dragon egg good. That was really bad. But this is the same thing. He was a regular boy from a small town, didn't really know a lot of this was happening, just kind of had his head down, you know, trying to just survive, make friends, and live his life, maybe get a girlfriend. And then things happen, and he just gets thrown in and is kind of the chosen one, but he was, like, never meant to be the chosen one, because they didn't think that this was ever capable of happening again. So, again, you're just kind of learning the magic and the world with him, because he didn't really get it. This was not my favorite fantasy read, but I think as a beginner fantasy, you could really enjoy it. It's got some Aragon type vibes, so again, if you liked Aragon, you might like that. And I just think that it's very easily accessible the way that City of Brass was, specifically Nari's POVs in City of Brass. And although Of Blood and Fire was not my favorite, the prequel novella was a 5-star read from me, and I absolutely adored it, and I cannot wait to continue with this series because I think Cahill is just going to get better and better as he goes in the story, in the writing. And I think that if you like Nari's POVs for that accessibility and the learning of the world, you would like it. I have another one for this category. Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This is a little bit more sci-fi, but I think reads new adult the way that City of Brass does. And specifically, again, we are following a rebellion, which is kind of what we follow in City of Brass, and you're following our main character learn so much more, because again, he's kind of stuck in his bubble at the bottom of the totem pole, and then moves his way up and is just like, oh crap, I need to learn everything again, and just has to rethink his typical thinking. So I think you learn so much with our protagonist. Red Rising is probably my least 100% comparable. The other two I feel like were a lot stronger, but maybe that's also because I haven't read Red Rising in a really long time. But I do think that it's kind of that accessibility again. I just found Nari's character and chapters very accessible as a beginner fantasy, and I think all of these are accessible if you're interested in getting into fantasy. Red Rising, you're following Darrow, who is a red, which is like the lowest of the totem pole, who, when something happens to him, he is upset and he ends up joining the rebellion and kind of taking down the Empire, which I think all 3 of those books kind of have in common, in a way. Some of them are a little bit looser than others, but then we're on to the next category, where is Allie's POVs. If you really liked Allie's POVs, if you liked specifically like the politics and the scheming that happened in Allie's POVs, here are some recs. I have a couple in this category as well. The first one is The Bone Char Daughter by Andrea Stewart. Now, this is, I think, a very political heavy book / series, but this one is very accessible. This is the most accessible out of the recommendations I have for this category. It is about, I can't say too much. We're essentially following a world where the magic system is bone shard. So you make these like figures, these humanoid creatures, they're not humanoid, I don't know how to explain them, out of bone shards. And the magic, and so a bone shard is taken from every human when they're a kid, and then the life from that person is now connected to that creature, so it's kind of slowly draining the life of whoever that bone shard came from. Power this bone shard creature. And we're following 3 different POVs in this one. One is Lynn, who is the princess daughter of the king, the bone shard daughter. And then we're following Jovis, who has kind of made a name for himself as like a vigilante of the Bone Shard, but he never really meant for that to happen. He's just trying to figure out what happened to his wife. And then we follow a protagonist who is kind of part of the rebellion. Apparently I like books with rebellions, and I find rebellion books very accessible because something about the way they're written. With this one, we're getting a lot of scheming and politics, and it's not as heavy or as dense as a lot of political fantasies are. City of Brass was not as dense, but we did get a lot of that, especially throughout the rest of the trilogy. So the Bone Shard daughter, I think, would be a very good place to start if you wanted to get a little bit more political in your reading. The next one I have is Illborn by Daniel T. Jackson. This, again, is an indie self-pubbed. This one is a lot denser than the other ones, but again, we're following kids who, well, not kids, they're, I think, 20-something, who are learning their powers. They all of a sudden wake up and they have these abilities after a vision that they got. There's 4 of them, and because of the fact that they're learning their powers, you kind of have that accessibility because you get to learn everything with them, kind of like you do in Nari's. But I want to put this more in Ali's recommendation just because it is a little bit more dense with a lot more scheming and politics and religion that happens in it, which religion is, again, another heavy part of City of Brass because of, well, I wouldn't even say religion, but maybe culture, but in Illborn it's more religion. But I do think that if you're willing to step into a little bit of a denser read, Illborn could be a good one for you, especially because we're following younger main characters, which I think also adds to that accessibility of new adult. And the last one I have for Ali's POV is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. Elantris is one of my all-time favorite books. It is politics galore. If you really enjoyed the politics, read Elantris. I still think this book was very accessible. You're following 3 different POVs. One who is the Prince Roedin, who gets a sickness that then throws him into the city of Elantris. When you get this sickness, essentially for the rest of your life, nothing heals. So you stub your toe and you're stuck with a stubbed toe and that pain for the rest of your life. The world does not know what causes this sickness, so instead of dealing with it, there's no cure for it. They throw anyone who has the sickness into the city of Elantris to never be seen again. Elantris itself has its own mystery because the gods used to live there and have since then disappeared, same with the magic of Elantris. Then you're following, I forget her name, but the forced marriage. There's an arranged marriage for the girl and Roedin as she comes and never gets to meet her fiancé because she's now a widow because essentially being thrown into Elantris, you're dead. So you're following her as she kind of is now a princess to this kingdom and doesn't know what to do, and she's trying to figure out everything and how to save her own kingdom because that's why they needed this marriage. And then you're following a priest who is on a cultural annihilation, a religious zealot who just wants to spread his religion to everyone, and everything just kind of schemes together. It's brilliant. It's great. It is often criticized as Sanderson's least incredible, like least good piece of work and literature, but it's my personal favorite. And I've read Mistborn, Elantris, Way of Kings, and Skyward. I just haven't read Warbreaker. I haven't continued the Stormlight Archive, and I'm on to book 5 in Mistborn, so the second book of Era 2. But it is still my favorite. I love this for its politics. It's very different than anything else Sanderson has written, so if you have tried Sanderson and you didn't like those, I still recommend trying Elantris because it's less unique world building. It is still unique, but more about the politics, and I 100% think that if you liked the politics in City of Brass, you will like the politics in this. And then if you just liked the fact that City of Brass was not a Western fantasy, if you just liked the unique setting it had, here are a couple. We have Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter, which is a lot more high adult fantasy and does again lean towards grimdark, but it is an African setting. It follows Tau, who is a lesser race. And when something happens by the hands of a superior race, it sends Tau on a mission for revenge, and he's solely focused on revenge, and that leads him to incredible places. The magic system in this book is something very unique to me, and I think that comes from being a non-Western non-European type fantasy. We are inspired by a lot more than just what we're used to in fantasy, and I think it's incredible, and this book deserves so much more love than it gets, even though it does get a lot of love. So if you just wanted a different take on fantasy, I highly suggest Rage of Dragons. I mean, can I have a recommendation video without the Poppy War? The Poppy War is another one that is Asian-inspired, non-Western setting. We are in the Sino-Second Japanese War, essentially. It's based on real-life things that happened, so once you read it, go look up the disturbing things that we did that are word for word in this series, and it's crazy. It hit me closer to home than if I had read it from a textbook because I was so emotionally connected to the characters, and when I realized it was really what happened, I was horrified, which is something I loved about the book, but not everyone loves. But the Poppy War follows Rin, who is a dark-skinned peasant girl, and she somehow manages to pass this exam with flying colors, and the top passing grad people get sent to the top military school on a free scholarship. So even though she was probably never supposed to, well, even though she was really never supposed to get there, never supposed to succeed because she didn't have the education or the same privilege that other people had, she goes to this military school and she proves herself time and time again. And then it turns into a military fantasy, and it's dark. It's about the war that happened, and it's so incredible. The only other I feel like that I can think of off the top of my head, because I didn't put thinking into this setting, for a non-Western setting is Nomads of the Sea. This is the only one on this recommendation list that isn't Own Voices. The author is actually Canadian, but I personally think he does a great job, but also I can't speak for people of this culture, and I would love to see some Own Voices reviews on this, but he does take, well, it's not even a culture because he just takes inspiration from Southeast Asia cultures because it is on a peninsula? That's not what it's called. But I would like to just say it is an Own Voices where the other two were, but I do still really enjoy this, and I really enjoyed its take on a non-Western fantasy, and this one is specifically, same with the Poppy War and the Rage of Dragons, very anti-colonialism. Where City of Brass is not really, but these three all are. This one we are following we're following the Nissi archipelago? Can't say that word. We're gonna pretend that I'm smarter than this. And the Mangal people who need help because there is a civil war happening, so they ask the Listen Empire for help. And then we have a character from the Listen Empire, and you're just kind of going on a military, also all three of these are military when City of Brass isn't. It's a military fantasy, and they're on a military expedition, and you see the Listen Empire culture and the Mangal people culture, and kind of how they go head to head, and the differences and the similarities, and it's a really big discussion and conversation about war and colonialism and all this other stuff, but it does happen in a non-European setting, so here's my recommendation. But it's a chunker, but it's really good. That's it for my recommendations on City of Brass. I hope that if you end up picking any of these up, that they were what you expected or what you wanted out of them. I hope this helped you find some new fantasy books. City of Brass is one of my favorite series, and as I said, it's one of the series I tell everyone to read when they want to get into fantasy and adult fantasy, because it just, I haven't met a person that it doesn't work for. I'm going to say this and then my comments are going to overflow with I didn't like City of Brass, but I DNF'd City of Brass twice before I finally read it the third time, and let me say I'm so happy that I kept trying because it is so good, so incredible, and I hope that you enjoy some of these other books on this list too. Is there a book that you would actually love to see this type of video from? Because this was kind of fun to make. Let me know down below in the comments. And if you'd like to leave me an emoji just to say you were here, leave me a camel emoji. And if you'd like to connect with me on other platforms, my Bookstagram, my Book Twitter, my Goodreads, and my Patreon are all linked in the description bar below. Have yourselves an absolutely remarkable day.